Welcome to Caveman Sleep Stories. If you're here tonight, you're likely searching for rest, hoping to quiet the mind that won't settle and find your way gently toward sleep. We live in a world of massive cities and endless social networks where communities number in the thousands, yet we often feel alone. But there's something we've lost in all this expansion, something our ancestors understood instinctively. Tonight, we're exploring a question that reveals a profound pattern. Why did prehistoric people consistently live in groups of exactly 25 to 30 individuals? Not 15, not 50, but this specific range that appears again and again across continents and millennia. Why did groups that grew larger split apart? Why did smaller groups seek to merge or recruit? What made this particular number the sweet spot where human communities thrived? We'll discover how resource needs matched defensible territories at this scale, how hunting parties could take down large game, how everyone could know everyone else intimately, how decisions happened without hierarchy, how knowledge stayed preserved, and how winter survival required exactly these numbers. We'll learn about the mathematics of group size, the thresholds where cooperation works or fails, and the remarkable convergence of multiple pressures, all pointing toward the same answer. If you drift off while listening, that's exactly what should happen. Consider subscribing if these stories help you find rest, and there's a Buy Me a Coffee link in the description if you'd like to support this channel. A like helps others discover these sleep stories too. Now settle in, get comfortable, and let's travel back to a time when groups found their perfect size through survival itself, when 25 to 30 people wasn't tradition, but optimization. The Goldilocks zone where ancient communities balanced every challenge life presented. The fire burns low now, coals glowing soft orange in the darkness, and around it, bodies settle into the familiar arrangement that has sustained human groups since the beginning, not randomly scattered but deliberately close, the way stones fit together in a wall, each one supporting the others, creating something stronger than any single piece alone. 27 people rest here tonight, which might seem like a specific, perhaps arbitrary number, but spend enough nights with groups of different sizes and the wisdom of this particular range becomes clear through experience, through survival, through the subtle ways that too few bodies create vulnerability and too many create different problems entirely. This group, this particular collection of 27 individuals, represents something close to optimal, a balance point discovered not through planning or decision, but through the patient, unforgiving teacher that is survival itself. Generation after generation, finding that groups smaller than about 20 face difficulties that groups of 30 avoid, while groups larger than 35 begin encountering troubles that groups of 25 never see. The number isn't magic, it's mathematics, it's biology. It's the intersection of a dozen different survival pressures, each one pulling group size in its own direction, each one creating its own threshold, where suddenly things work or suddenly they don't. And the remarkable fact, the thing worth contemplating as sleep approaches, is that all these different pressures, all these separate optimization problems, converge on roughly the same range, somewhere between 25 and 30 people, give or take a few depending on the environment and season, making this not a cultural preference or random tradition, but rather an evolutionary solution, a Goldilocks zone where human groups could balance all the competing demands that staying alive placed upon them. Consider just the most basic question first, the one that shapes everything else, which is simply how many people can be fed from a given area of land, because all other considerations become academic if the group starves. And this calculation, worked out not with numbers, but with hungry stomachs over countless generations, reveals the first boundary that constrains group size. Each person requires food, and that food comes from the land, from the animals that move across it and the plants that grow in it. And in the typical mixed environment of the Pleistocene, the grasslands and open woodlands and river valleys where most human groups lived, ethnographic studies of modern hunter-gatherers combined with archaeological evidence suggest that each person requires somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of a square mile to provide adequate nutrition year-round without depleting the resources faster than they can regenerate. This isn't a number that ancient people calculated explicitly, of course, but rather a reality they learned through the direct experience of hunger, discovering that when too many people tried to live off too small an area, the plants they relied on got harvested faster than they could grow back. The animals they hunted became scarce or moved away entirely, and the group faced a choice between spreading out to cover more ground, which brought its own dangers, or reducing numbers through some mechanism, whether that meant groups splitting into smaller bands or the grim mathematics of starvation doing the work for them. For a group of 25 people, the mathematics works out to roughly 12 to 15 square miles of territory needed to sustain them comfortably, assuming they're utilizing the land efficiently, moving seasonally to follow resources, allowing harvested areas to recover before returning to them, managing their range the way gardeners manage plots by rotation and rest. 15 square miles sounds like a large area, and in some ways it is, but consider the shape and nature of such a territory, which typically follows rivers and streams where resources concentrate, extending along water sources that provide not just drinking water, but the plants that grow near water and the animals that come to drink, creating a linear territory that might stretch for 20 miles along a watercourse while extending only half a mile back from the water on each side, a ribbon of abundant land that a group of 25 or 30 can traverse in a day's walk and know intimately in all seasons, every productive spot for gathering, every game trail, every sheltered camping location, every source of tool stone and fuel wood. This specific territory size, this 12 to 15 square miles, becomes important when considering the next optimization problem, which is defense, because territory isn't just about food sources, but also about what you can actually control and protect against both animal predators and other human groups who might want to use the same resources. A group of 25 to 30 people can effectively monitor and defend a territory of this size through a combination of regular patrols, established camping sites that cover the range, and the simple presence of enough people that encountering members of the group becomes likely for anyone or anything trying to intrude. The mathematics of effective territory defense follows what might be called a perimeter to defenders ratio, where the length of boundary you need to watch has to match the number of people available to do the watching, and for 15 square miles, which has a perimeter of roughly 15 to 20 miles depending on its shape, a group of 25 to 30 can maintain awareness and respond to threats before they penetrate deep into the territory. But increase the group size to 40 or 50 people, and suddenly the resource calculation changes dramatically, because 50 people require not 15 square miles, but something closer to 25 square miles to sustain them without overusing the land, and 25 square miles of territory has a perimeter approaching 30 miles. And now the ratio has shifted unfavorably, where despite having more people, the group actually has less defensive capability per mile of boundary, making the territory harder to monitor effectively and more vulnerable to both animal predators that learn to enter at unpatched sections and rival human groups that might attempt to hunt in the area or establish their own presence. The larger group needs more land, but the more land they need, the harder it becomes to defend it, creating a negative feedback loop where expansion meant to solve the food problem creates a security problem that can prove equally dangerous, And this dynamic, this tension between needing more territory and being able to defend it, creates a natural ceiling on group size somewhere around 30 to 35 people, beyond which the problems of territorial control begin to outweigh the benefits of additional numbers. On the opposite end of the scale, groups smaller than 20 people face the inverse problem, where they can defend a smaller territory more intensively, concentrating their defensive capability on a tighter perimeter. But they struggle to fully utilize even that smaller territory because they lack the numbers to cover it efficiently, to be in multiple places at once doing the gathering and hunting and monitoring that extracting resources from the land requires. A group of 15 people trying to live off 10 square miles sounds like it should work mathematically, and in terms of raw resources available versus mouths to feed, it does work. But in practice, those 15 people find themselves spread too thin, unable to effectively gather plants from the far corners of their range, while also hunting, while also maintaining tools, while also watching for dangers, discovering that territory control requires not just theoretical ownership, but actual presence. The ability to be there using the resources before someone or something else does. And 15 people simply can't be enough places at once to make full use of 10 square miles without running themselves into exhaustion through constant movement and divided attention. So a first major reason why groups gravitate toward 25 to 30 people emerges from this basic resource to territory to defense calculation, where 25 people need about 12 to 15 square miles to feed themselves sustainably, and 12 to 15 square miles is an area that 25 people can actually defend effectively, creating a match between needs and capabilities that smaller groups can't achieve because they can't fully use their territory, and larger groups can't achieve because their expanded territory becomes indefensible, making 25 to 30 the sweet spot where resource needs, territorial size, and defensive capacity all align in a sustainable way. This isn't yet the complete answer, not even close, but it's the foundation, the first constraint that shapes what's possible. And as the fire burns lower and bodies relax into the earth, consider how this balance feels, how a group of this size creates a sense of security and sufficiency, of being neither stretched too thin nor crowded too close, of fitting the land rather than fighting against it. But territory and resources represent only the beginning of the optimization problem, because within that territory, specific activities need to happen. Specific tasks must be accomplished to convert the land's potential into actual survival, and chief among these is hunting, particularly the hunting of large game that provides the rich protein and fat that human bodies need to thrive in cold climates and active lifestyles. The question of how many hunters a group needs becomes crucial when we understand what hunting large animals actually requires, not as a solo endeavor or even a partnership, but as a coordinated group activity where success depends entirely on having enough people to execute complex, dangerous hunting strategies that smaller groups simply cannot attempt, making hunting capability another factor that pushes toward larger groups while simultaneously revealing why groups can't grow too large without encountering different problems. Consider the mammoth not as an abstract prehistoric animal, but as a specific hunting challenge, a creature weighing perhaps 4 to 6 tons, equipped with tusks and a fierce temperament when threatened, capable of killing a human with a single swing of its trunk or a careless step of its massive feet. Archaeological sites show that humans successfully hunted these animals, but the evidence also shows that successful mammoth hunting required something like 6 to 8 hunters minimum, and more typically 8 to 10, working together with prepared weapons, coordinated positioning, and careful timing to bring down such a dangerous prey animal with acceptable risk. 8 to 10 hunters represents a significant fraction of any group's adult population, And when we calculate backward from this requirement, asking how large a total group needs to be to field 8 to 10 capable hunters reliably, we arrive at interesting numbers that begin to explain why 25 to 30 emerges as optimal. A group of 25 to 30 people typically contains between 12 and 18 adults in their prime hunting years, roughly between ages 18 and 45, when physical strength and endurance peak and experience has accumulated, but bodies haven't yet degraded significantly. Of those 12 to 18 adults, roughly half are women, many of whom are pregnant, nursing, or caring for young children for significant portions of their adult lives, though not all women and not constantly, and hunting, especially hunting large, dangerous game, falls primarily, though not exclusively, to the men and to women without current childcare responsibilities, creating a pool of perhaps 8 to 12 individuals at any given time who are both capable of and available for major hunting efforts. 8 to 12 available hunters means that the group can field a full hunting party of 8 to 10 people for a major hunt while still leaving 2 to 4 capable adults back at camp to handle defense, to manage other work, to serve as backup in case something goes wrong, creating both the capacity for ambitious hunting and the security margin that prevents one bad day from becoming a catastrophe. Compare this to a smaller group, say 15 people total, which might contain only 6 to 9 adults in prime hunting years, which translates to perhaps 3 to 5 available hunters after accounting for child care and other essential roles, and 3 to 5 hunters simply cannot take down a mammoth safely, or perhaps at all, lacking the numbers to surround the animal, to coordinate the simultaneous strikes from multiple directions that successful mammoth hunting requires, to position themselves such that if one hunter gets in trouble, others can intervene before the situation becomes fatal. A group of 15 can hunt smaller game successfully, can take deer and smaller animals that 1 or 2 skilled hunters can handle, but they're effectively shut out from the large game that provides the biggest caloric returns, the hunts where a successful kill means abundant meat for days or even weeks, enough to see the group through hard times or brutal weather when hunting smaller animals becomes difficult or impossible. Groups that size face a harsh calculus, where their limited numbers force them toward smaller game, which means more hunting trips needed to feed everyone, which means more time and energy spent hunting relative to the nutrition gained, which means less time for other essential activities, creating an efficiency problem that compounds over time into genuine vulnerability during periods when any hunting becomes difficult, where a larger group's ability to bring down large animals and store the meat means they can weather temporary setbacks, while the smaller group, dependent on constant successful hunting of small animals, faces immediate hunger when conditions turn poor. The archaeological record bears this out through analysis of remains at different sites where larger group occupations show evidence of more large game consumption, while smaller groups show heavier reliance on smaller animals and gathered plants, not necessarily because they preferred these foods, but because their numbers constrained what hunting strategies remained available to them. On the opposite end, one might think that even larger groups, say 40 or 50 people, would be even better for hunting, fielding perhaps 12 to 18 available hunters who could take on even more ambitious hunts or conduct multiple hunting parties simultaneously. But here we encounter the opposite problem, which is that the gains from additional hunters beyond about 10 begin to diminish rapidly, while the costs continue rising linearly. A mammoth hunting party of 12 isn't significantly more successful than a party of 8, because the animal only has so many vulnerable points, only so many angles of approach that matter, and adding more hunters beyond the optimal number mostly just means more people in danger, more coordination complexity, more risk of hunters accidentally interfering with each other's positions or strikes. Meanwhile, those 12 hunters represent mouths to feed, and the group of 40 or 50 people they came from needs correspondingly more food overall, needing to hunt more frequently, putting more pressure on game populations in their territory, creating the real possibility of overhunting where prey animals become scarce through excessive harvesting or simply learn to avoid the area entirely, moving to ranges where hunting pressure is lighter. The mathematics of hunting return versus hunting pressure reveals another sweet spot, where groups of 25 to 30 can field enough hunters to take large game reliably while hunting infrequently enough that game populations remain stable, finding the balance between exploitation and conservation that keeps their territory productive over the long term. This balance requires both having enough hunters to execute ambitious hunts successfully and not having so many mouths to feed that you're forced to hunt so constantly that you deplete the very resources you depend on. Another case where 25 to 30 represents the convergence point, where hunting capability matches nutritional needs without overshooting into unsustainability. As the last embers glow and consciousness softens, imagine the satisfaction of that balance, of knowing that tomorrow's hunt stands a good chance of success, that the group contains enough skilled hands to bring down worthwhile game, but not so many people that every day becomes a desperate scramble to find enough meat. The calm confidence that comes from being neither too weak nor too hungry, just the right size for the work that needs doing. While hunting provides crucial protein and fat, gathered plant foods form the reliable foundation of the diet, the steady calories that keep bodies fed even when hunting fails or weather makes hunting impossible. And gathering, unlike hunting, scales more directly with the number of people available to do it, creating a different optimization problem where having more gatherers generally means more food collected, but only up to a point before you begin encountering diminishing returns from overcrowding of productive areas and the inefficiencies of too many people trying to work the same ground. The question becomes not how many gatherers minimum do you need, but rather what's the optimal number of gatherers for a given territory size. And again, the mathematics points toward groups of 25 to 30 people as hitting a sweet spot where gathering efficiency maximizes without crossing into counterproductive overcrowding. Gathering plant foods requires knowledge, careful observation of what's edible and when it's ripe and where it grows, and also requires simply covering ground, walking the territory to find scattered resources, checking productive spots regularly to harvest them at peak ripeness before animals eat them or they spoil, dedicating enough person hours to the task that the group's territory gets adequately utilized without leaving valuable calories unharvested. A territory of 12 to 15 square miles, the range that comfortably supports 25 to 30 people, contains hundreds of discrete gathering spots, places where edible roots grow or nut trees stand or berry bushes cluster, or edible shoots emerge in spring, each spot requiring attention at specific times, creating a scheduling and logistics problem of ensuring that someone checks each productive location at the right time without wasting effort through duplicate coverage or missing locations entirely through poor coordination. A group of 25 to 30 people typically includes about 12 to 18 adults and older children capable of gathering, and of those perhaps 8 to 12 are primarily focused on gathering at any given time, with others handling hunting, tool making, childcare, and other specialized tasks. 8 to 12 gatherers can effectively cover 12 to 15 square miles through a combination of daily foraging trips where 2 to 4 people work together in a specific area, systematically checking known productive spots and exploring for new ones, and through accumulated knowledge shared among the group about where different plants grow and when they're harvestable, creating an informal but effective system where the territory gets adequate coverage without any one person exhausting themselves through excessive walking or any productive spot getting neglected through lack of attention. The numbers work out such that each gatherer or small gathering team can focus on a manageable area, perhaps 1 to 2 square miles, checking it thoroughly, harvesting what's ready, noting what needs another week or two, building intimate knowledge of that section while other gatherers do the same for their sections, and the group as a whole, through sharing information and coordinating efforts loosely around the evening fire, maintains awareness of the entire territory's resources and their status. Compare this to a smaller group, perhaps 15 people total, which might have only 4 to 6 primary gatherers and 4 to 6 people attempting to cover 12 to 15 square miles, means each person must range more widely, walking longer distances each day, checking their assigned territory less frequently, creating gaps in coverage where ripe foods go unharvested because no one got there in time, where productivity declines, not because resources don't exist, but because the group lacks enough eyes and hands to find and collect them efficiently. The smaller group faces a choice between accepting lower gathering returns from their territory or working their few gatherers harder, demanding longer days and more exhausting range walking, which works for a while but creates fatigue and burnout, increasing injury risk and decreasing the quality of decision-making about what to harvest and what to leave for later, gradually grinding down the group's effectiveness through overwork. On the other end, a group of 40 or 50 people, with perhaps 15 to 20 active gatherers, might seem better still, more eyes finding more food. But here, the problem shifts to territorial overcrowding, where 15 to 20 gatherers working 12 to 15 square miles means more competition for the same resources, more people arriving at the same berry bush on the same day, more harvesting pressure on productive spots that begins to exceed the rate at which plants can regenerate, and crucially, more coordination complexity about who goes where, when, because now the informal system of people generally knowing what areas others plan to check breaks down with too many participants, creating duplicated effort where multiple gatherers walk to the same spot, not knowing others are already heading there, or creating gaps where everyone assumes someone else is checking a particular area and therefore no one does. The classic coordination failures that emerge when groups grow large enough that informal communication stops being sufficient. The larger group also encounters the problem that 25 square miles, the territory needed to support 40 to 50 people, has more gathering spots total, but each individual spot doesn't necessarily produce proportionally more food. So gatherers in the larger group spend more time traveling between productive spots, more time walking relative to time spent actually harvesting, decreasing overall efficiency even as total food collected increases. There's an optimal ratio of gatherers to territory where each person's effort yields maximum return, where they walk enough to find good resources, but not so far that walking time dominates their day, where enough people cover the ground that nothing gets missed, but not so many that they interfere with each other. And that ratio, worked out through generations of experience, seems to fall somewhere around 8 to 12 gatherers for 12 to 15 square miles, which maps directly back to groups of 25 to 30 people once you account for the fraction of the population engaged primarily in gathering. The efficiency of gathering at this scale shows up in archaeological evidence from living sites, where analysis of plant remains shows diverse utilization of available resources, evidence that groups were successfully finding and processing many different plant foods from across their territory, suggesting adequate coverage and knowledge of the landscape, while also showing patterns of seasonal focus where groups concentrated on whatever was most abundant at any given time, rather than being forced to harvest everything available regardless of readiness, because they lacked the numbers to be selective. Groups of optimal size, with adequate gatherers relative to their territory, could afford to be choosy, taking the best and most nutritious resources at peak ripeness, while leaving less optimal resources for later or for wildlife, maintaining both their own nutrition at high levels and the health of plant populations through selective harvesting that mimicked natural patterns better than the desperate everything harvesting that smaller groups with too few gatherers sometimes required. So, gathering efficiency provides another pressure toward groups of 25 to 30, where numbers align with territory size to create optimal coverage, adequate harvesting, and efficient use of human effort, avoiding both the overwork and reduced returns of too few gatherers, and the coordination problems and overcrowding of too many gatherers on too little land. As sleep deepens and thoughts drift, feel that balance, that sense of the work being distributed properly, neither too few hands doing too much, nor too many hands getting in each other's way, the quiet satisfaction of a group scaled correctly for its territory and tasks, where tomorrow's gathering will be productive without being exhausting, where the berries will be found and the roots dug and everyone will eat well because the numbers work out right. Beyond the practical matters of hunting and gathering lies a deeper constraint on group size that operates at the level of cognitive capacity, the fundamental limits of how many people a human brain can actually maintain meaningful relationships with, track the social dynamics of, remember the history and patterns of interactions with. And this constraint, studied extensively in modern social psychology, but clearly visible in traditional societies, suggests that human brains are adapted for groups up to a certain size, beyond which the quality of relationships degrades, the ability to maintain true intimacy disappears, and the need for formal social structures to manage complexity becomes unavoidable, creating another pressure that keeps groups from growing too large even when resources might theoretically support larger numbers. This cognitive limit, often called Dunbar's number after the anthropologist who studied it most thoroughly, manifests not as a hard wall, but as a series of circles of intimacy, where humans can maintain roughly 5 extremely close relationships, about 15 close relationships, around 50 casual but meaningful relationships, and approximately 150 people whose names and basic information they can remember, with each larger circle involving progressively less intimate knowledge and weaker emotional bonds. For a group living together daily, sharing food and shelter and dangers, the relevant circle is that innermost one, the roughly 50 people with whom truly meaningful relationships remain possible, where you know not just someone's name, but their personality, their preferences, their history, their skills, their quirks, their reliability, where you can predict how they'll respond to situations based on deep familiarity, where conflicts can be resolved through appeal to shared history and mutual understanding, rather than through formal mediation, where trust is personal and tested rather than abstract and assumed. A group of 25 to 30 people falls comfortably within this circle, small enough that everyone can know everyone else at this intimate level, creating a social fabric where relationships are dense and strong, where reputation is personal and immediate, where there are no strangers and no anonymous actors, only individuals whose character and capabilities are known through extended direct experience. This intimacy level creates several important effects for group survival and cohesion. First, decision-making can remain largely consensual, with all adults participating in discussions about where to move, when to hunt, how to respond to threats, what rules or customs to follow. Because 25 to 30 people can actually conduct such discussions in a single conversation, can hear all voices, can reach agreements through discussion rather than voting or hierarchical command, maintaining the egalitarian structure that characterizes most hunter-gatherer societies, and avoiding the need for formal leadership positions that inevitably create hierarchy and inequality. A conversation among 30 people can still be a conversation, where everyone hears everyone else, where points can be debated, where consensus can emerge organically from discussion. But a conversation among 50 people stops being a conversation and becomes something more like a meeting or assembly, requiring someone to moderate who speaks when, requiring summarization and representation rather than direct participation, changing the fundamental nature of group decision-making from direct democracy to something more structured and less personally involving. Second, conflict resolution remains possible through personal relationships and community pressure at this scale. When everyone knows everyone intimately, when two people in conflict both have deep relationships with all other group members, those other members can effectively mediate by appealing to the parties' better natures, by reminding them of past cooperation, by applying social pressure through the weight of shared history and mutual dependence, creating resolution mechanisms that work precisely because the group is small enough that no one can afford to alienate the community, because everyone needs everyone else's cooperation for survival, because reputation and relationships matter more than winning any particular dispute. In larger groups, beyond about 40 to 50 people, conflicts increasingly involve people who don't know each other well, where no mediator has strong enough relationships with both parties to effectively intervene, where the community is too large for social pressure to work reliably, necessitating formal systems of arbitration, rules about acceptable behavior, punishments for violations, all the apparatus of formal justice that smaller groups simply don't need because personal accountability and direct relationships handle most conflicts before they escalate. Third, trust and cooperation can remain based on demonstrated character rather than formal reputation systems at this scale. In a group of 25 to 30, if someone proves unreliable, everyone knows it through direct experience or through trusted first-hand reports from close companions, creating immediate consequences through reduced cooperation and lowered status, without any need for formal mechanisms to track reputation or punish bad behavior. Likewise, someone who proves consistently helpful and capable gains immediate returns through increased cooperation and higher status, creating tight feedback loops between behavior and consequences that maintain cooperation without formal enforcement. In larger groups, you increasingly encounter people you don't know well personally, requiring formal reputation systems, rules about fair dealing, authorities to enforce those rules, all because the group has grown too large for direct knowledge of everyone's character to be possible, for personal relationships to create sufficient accountability. The archaeological evidence, while indirect, supports this picture, showing that living sites from the Paleolithic typically show signs of occupation by groups in the 25 to 35 person range based on hearth spacing, shelter sizes, and artifact densities, rarely showing evidence of much larger permanent groups, suggesting that even when resources might have supported larger concentrations of people, groups chose to remain smaller, split into bands of this optimal size rather than clustering into villages of 50 or 75 or 100, and the most plausible explanation for this choice centers on cognitive and social limits, on the recognition that groups beyond a certain size lose the intimacy and egalitarian simplicity that makes them function smoothly, that larger groups require formal structures and hierarchy and loss of personal autonomy that people instinctively resist, that there's a quality of life difference between living with 25 people you know intimately and living with 50 people, half of whom are effectively strangers. So the social brain's limits provide another strong pressure toward groups of 25 to 30, where human cognitive capacity for meaningful relationships matches actual group size, where intimacy remains possible, where decisions can be consensus-based, where conflicts resolve personally, where trust comes from character and experience rather than formal systems, creating groups that feel cohesive and manageable in ways that larger groups simply cannot replicate, regardless of their practical advantages. Another case where 25 to 30 represents not random chance, but the convergence of human nature with group dynamics, the size where we remain most fully human in our relationships, rather than becoming parts of more impersonal organizational structures. Rest now in the knowledge of right-sized community, of knowing and being known, of belonging to something large enough to provide security, but small enough to maintain genuine intimacy, the comfort of being neither lost in a crowd nor isolated with too few companions. Children require adults, not just to produce them, but to raise them successfully through the long, dependent childhood that humans uniquely experience. Where infants remain helpless for months, toddlers require constant supervision for years, and children need active teaching and protection until adolescence, creating a substantial burden of childcare that any group must distribute among its adult members in ways that don't overwhelm caregivers while ensuring that children receive adequate attention for healthy development. The ratio of adults to children becomes crucial for group survival, because too few adults relative to children means caretaking becomes overwhelming, individual children receive insufficient attention, child mortality rises, and the group's future reproduction gets compromised. While too many adults relative to children might seem fine, but actually indicates a problem with the group's reproductive success, suggesting that birth rates are too low to replace adults as they age and die, pointing toward eventual group extinction through demographic failure. Ethnographic studies of hunter-gatherer groups suggest that a sustainable adult-to-child ratio falls somewhere around 2 adults for every child, or put differently, that each adult woman produces roughly 2 to 4 children during her reproductive years who survive to adulthood, which sounds low by modern standards but reflects the realities of Paleolithic mortality, nutrition, and fertility patterns, where pregnancies occur every 3 to 4 years due to extended nursing that suppresses ovulation, where infant mortality claims perhaps 1 in 4 births before age 5, where reaching adulthood means surviving to roughly age 15, creating a demographic steady state where each generation roughly replaces itself if conditions remain favorable and shrinks if conditions deteriorate. This demographic pattern means that at any given time, a stable group's population consists of roughly equal numbers of adults and children, or perhaps slightly more children than adults in thriving groups, creating a dependency ratio where every 2 adults support themselves and approximately 1 to 2 children on average. For a group of 25 to 30 people, this demographic breakdown typically means about 12 to 18 adults and 10 to 15 children of various ages, creating an adult-to-child ratio of around 1.2 to 1.8 adults per child, comfortably within the sustainable range where adults can provide adequate care without becoming overwhelmed. With 12 to 18 adults, the group can allocate child care responsibilities such that some adults focus primarily on hunting and gathering, while others focus primarily on child care, creating a division of labor where perhaps 4 to 6 adults at any given time are actively minding children, keeping them safe, feeding them, teaching them basic skills, while the remaining 8 to 12 adults focus on food procurement and other necessary work. And these roles can rotate as needed, preventing any individual from being stuck permanently in pure child care duty while ensuring that children always have adequate supervision. This flexibility matters tremendously for both adult well-being and child development. Adults engaged in constant child care without breaks experience burnout and fatigue, becoming less effective caregivers and more prone to frustration or neglect, while children benefit from exposure to multiple adult caregivers with different personalities and teaching styles, learning varied skills, and developing diverse relationships that make them more resilient and socially capable. A group of 25 to 30 with 12 to 18 adults naturally creates enough adult diversity that children encounter different approaches and learn from multiple sources, while no single adult becomes trapped in endless child care, maintaining both adult mental health and child developmental quality. Another way that the optimal group size serves everyone's needs through appropriate scaling of resources to demands. Compare this to smaller groups, where perhaps 15 people total includes only 6 to 9 adults and 6 to 9 children, and suddenly the ratio becomes precarious, where each adult is effectively responsible for approximately one child continuously, meaning that if all adults are to engage in food procurement simultaneously, children must come along or remain unsupervised, neither option being ideal, or that only a few adults can hunt and gather at any time, while others remain at camp with all the children, reducing the group's foraging efficiency dramatically and creating the adult burnout problem where caregivers never get breaks from childcare demands. The smaller group also lacks the diversity of adult caregivers, meaning children learn from fewer models, develop relationships with fewer adults, creating vulnerability if their primary caregiver dies or becomes incapacitated, which happens with unfortunate regularity in Paleolithic conditions where accidents, illnesses, and childbirth complications can quickly remove previously healthy adults from the group. Archaeological evidence, while necessarily indirect when it comes to child care practices, does show that children in larger groups appear to have fared better than those in smaller groups, based on skeletal evidence of childhood nutrition and growth patterns, where remains from larger occupation sites show fewer signs of childhood stress and better overall health markers than remains from smaller sites, suggesting that the additional adult attention and more reliable food supplies that larger groups could provide translated into measurably better child outcomes. This advantage compounds over time, where groups that successfully raise healthy children to adulthood grow and thrive, while groups that lose many children to preventable causes or fail to provide adequate developmental support shrink and eventually disappear, creating strong evolutionary pressure toward group sizes that optimize child-rearing success. On the larger end, groups of 40 to 50 people might seem even better for children, with perhaps 20 to 25 adults who could provide even more caregiving diversity and support. But here we encounter diminishing returns and new problems, where the sheer number of children in such groups, perhaps 15 to 25 kids of various ages, creates coordination and supervision challenges that smaller groups don't face, where it becomes difficult to keep track of that many children, where conflicts between children become more frequent and complex to resolve, where the intimate attention that each child needs gets diluted across too many recipients, similar to how a teacher with 30 students provides less individual attention than a teacher with 10 students regardless of the teacher's skill or dedication. Extremely large groups also tend toward age segregation, where children cluster with others their age rather than mixing across age ranges, losing the benefits of mixed-age play and learning where older children teach younger ones and younger children learn through observation of older ones, flattening the learning environment in ways that reduce its educational richness. So, optimal child rearing requires groups large enough to provide adequate adult-to-child ratios, diverse caregiving, and resilience against adult mortality, but not so large that children get lost in crowds, lose individual attention, or miss out on mixed-age socialization, pointing again toward 25 to 30 as the sweet spot where roughly 12 to 18 adults can successfully raise and educate 10 to 15 children, providing each child with multiple caring relationships, adequate supervision, and rich learning environments while maintaining adult well-being through distributed caregiving responsibilities. Another convergence on the same number from yet another angle. Sleep now with the thought of children raised well, surrounded by enough adults to feel secure, to learn from many sources, to develop into capable adults themselves. The quiet satisfaction of a group sized correctly for its most important work, which is always raising the next generation successfully enough that the group continues forward through time. Knowledge represents another crucial resource that groups must maintain and transmit across generations. The accumulated wisdom of what plants are edible, where to find tool stone, how to track animals, how to make fire, how to process hides, how to read weather signs, how to treat illnesses and injuries, and dozens or hundreds of other specific skills and information packets that determine whether a group survives or fails when critical situations arise. And this knowledge exists only in human brains, vulnerable to loss whenever a skilled practitioner dies before passing their expertise on to others, creating a preservation problem where groups must maintain enough skilled individuals for each critical domain, that losing one expert doesn't leave the group unable to perform essential tasks. The mathematics of knowledge redundancy pushes toward larger groups where multiple people possess critical skills, but not toward indefinitely large groups, because at some point additional redundancy provides diminishing returns while consuming resources that could support other useful specializations, creating another optimization problem that, perhaps unsurprisingly at this point, resolves around groups of 25 to 30 people. Consider the range of essential knowledge that a Paleolithic group needs to maintain, identifying hundreds of plant species as edible or poisonous, nutritious or marginal, locating them across seasons, and knowing when they're harvestable, tracking dozens of animal species, knowing their habits and habitats, and how to hunt them successfully, crafting multiple tool types from stone, bone, wood, and plant materials, each requiring specific techniques and materials, making fire reliably under various conditions, maintaining it, using it safely, processing animal carcasses efficiently, preserving meat, treating hides, creating clothing and shelter appropriate to climate, finding water sources, assessing their safety, treating common injuries and illnesses with available plants and procedures, reading weather patterns and navigating landscapes, mediating social conflicts and maintaining group cohesion, and passing all this knowledge to the next generation through teaching and example. This abbreviated list already includes perhaps 20 to 30 distinct knowledge domains, each requiring years to master, each critical enough that its absence creates serious survival risks. A group of 25 to 30 people, containing perhaps 12 to 18 adults of various ages and experience levels, can distribute this knowledge such that most critical domains have 2 to 4 knowledgeable practitioners, creating redundancy that protects against knowledge loss from individual deaths while avoiding excessive redundancy where too many people know the same things and not enough people know rare but occasionally critical skills. The mathematics works roughly as follows. If you have 20 distinct critical knowledge domains and 15 adults, each adult must maintain knowledge in roughly 1 to 2 domains to ensure that each domain has at least one expert. But this creates vulnerability where the death of that one expert in, say, medicinal plant knowledge could leave the group unable to treat certain illnesses until someone else learns through potentially fatal trial and error. If instead you have 20 domains and 30 adults, each adult can focus on one domain while critical domains have 2 or even 3 experts, creating safety margins where losing one expert leaves others who can continue practicing and teaching the skill to newer students. This redundancy becomes particularly crucial for skills that are difficult to learn or rarely practiced. Fire making, for instance, requires specific techniques and materials that might seem simple to someone with experience, but prove frustratingly difficult for novices. And while the need for fire is constant, the actual skill of creating fire from scratch using friction or percussion methods might only be necessary when existing fires go out unexpectedly, meaning people can maintain fires for weeks or months without actually needing to make new fire, creating scenarios where a young adult might have never personally made fire from scratch before the day the group's fire dies, and they need to create a new one urgently. Having 3 or 4 adults who possess strong fire-making skills means that at least one is likely present whenever the need arises, that multiple people can teach novices before the skill is needed critically, that the group never faces the terrifying situation of needing fire desperately, while no one present quite remembers how to make it reliably. Similarly, tracking skills, plant identification, hide processing, and many other knowledge domains benefit from having multiple experts who've learned slightly different techniques or who know variations appropriate to different seasons or situations, creating a richer knowledge base where the group can handle more scenarios successfully and where younger learners can absorb knowledge from multiple sources, picking up nuances and alternatives that make them more adaptable than if they learned from only a single teacher. The diversity of expertise that comes from having enough adults, that specialization and redundancy both remain possible, represents a significant survival advantage, one that smaller groups struggle to maintain and that larger groups maintain so easily that it stops being special or providing much additional benefit. In smaller groups, say 15 people with 6 to 9 adults, the knowledge preservation problem becomes acute, where either every adult must maintain rudimentary skill in all critical domains, becoming jacks of all trades and masters of none, or the group must accept gaps in knowledge where certain skills are poorly represented or absent entirely, hoping they never face situations requiring those particular capabilities, accepting higher risk in exchange for having fewer people to feed. The first option, universal generalization, sounds appealing in theory, but proves difficult in practice because humans have limited time and cognitive capacity, and maintaining even basic competence in 20 different skill domains requires constant practice and learning that competes with the time needed for actually using those skills to keep the group fed and safe, creating a treadmill where people spend so much time maintaining knowledge that they lack time to apply it effectively. The second option, accepting knowledge gaps, works fine until suddenly it doesn't, until the one person who knew medicinal plants dies in an accident, and then someone else develops a serious illness and the group can't treat it, or until weather patterns shift and the group needs to adjust their strategies, but lacks anyone with deep enough knowledge of weather signs to recognize what's happening in time to respond appropriately, creating catastrophic failures that smaller groups experience more frequently than larger groups simply because they lack knowledge redundancy. Another way that being small compromises long-term survival, even if it works fine most of the time. On the opposite end, groups of 50 or more people have such extensive knowledge redundancy that they can maintain 4 to 6 experts in each domain easily, which sounds wonderful, but actually creates inefficiencies, where multiple people invest time and effort in mastering skills that several others already know thoroughly, representing duplication of effort that doesn't actually improve group survival significantly compared to having 2 or 3 experts per domain, the way groups of 25 to 30 typically achieve. The larger group's knowledge abundance also enables increasingly specialized knowledge, where instead of 3 people knowing general medicinal plants, you get one person specializing in digestive remedies, another in wound treatments, another in fever reducers, creating fragmentation where total knowledge expands, but individual knowledge narrowing makes practitioners less flexible and more dependent on each other, edging toward the kind of specialization that characterizes later agricultural civilizations, but that hunter-gatherers generally avoid because it creates vulnerabilities when specialists become unavailable. So knowledge preservation and transmission create another pressure toward groups of 25 to 30, where 12 to 18 adults provide enough numbers that critical skills can be redundantly represented, creating safety margins against knowledge loss, while avoiding the excessive redundancy and increasing specialization that larger groups tend toward, maintaining instead the generalist with strengths pattern where each adult has broad basic competence plus deep knowledge in 1 or 2 domains, creating a flexible, resilient knowledge base that serves the group well across varied situations and challenges. Let that knowledge settle now, the sense of being part of a group properly sized to maintain and pass on what matters, where critical skills live in multiple minds, where learning can happen from several teachers, where the death of one expert wounds but doesn't cripple the group's capabilities, the security of knowledge preserved and shared across enough people that it remains safe. Daily work, the actual tasks that keep everyone alive from day to day, hunting, gathering, tool making, hide processing, firewood collection, water carrying, food preparation, child care, camp maintenance, and more, must be distributed across the group's adult members in ways that accomplish everything necessary without exhausting anyone, creating a workload distribution problem where having enough hands means work gets done without anyone being overburdened. But having too many hands means some people lack meaningful contributions or people get in each other's way, creating social tensions around perceived laziness or redundant effort. And once again, the mathematics of optimal distribution points toward groups of particular sizes where work balances naturally across available workers. Ethnographic studies of modern hunter-gatherers consistently show that adults in these societies work, meaning engage in direct food procurement and essential maintenance tasks, roughly 3 to 5 hours per day on average, with significant variation by season, age, and gender, but with this relatively light workload nonetheless accomplishing everything the group needs for survival and even comfort, creating an existence far removed from the constant, desperate toil that popular imagination assigns to primitive life. This light workload is possible only because groups are sized correctly for their territories and tasks, where enough people exist to distribute work efficiently, while not so many exist that the territory's resources get stretched thin and require more intensive exploitation to feed everyone. Another balance where 25 to 30 people seems to hit an optimum. Consider the daily work inventory for a group of 25 to 30 people. Approximately 2 to 3 hunters need to be out actively hunting on most days, or sometimes 6 to 8 for a major coordinated hunt. Approximately 4 to 6 gatherers need to be out collecting plants, nuts, and other vegetable foods. Approximately 2 to 3 people need to be engaged in tool maintenance and creation, sharpening blades, crafting new implements, repairing damaged equipment. Approximately 2 to 3 people need to be processing foods, butchering any meat that comes in, preparing gathered plants, cooking meals. Approximately 1 to 2 people need to be managing fire, collecting firewood, maintaining hearths. Approximately 3 to 5 people need to be engaged in child care. Approximately 1 to 2 people need to be doing hide processing if fresh hides are available. And approximately 2 to 3 people can be resting, ill, or engaged in social activities, storytelling, or other non-essential activities that nonetheless contribute to group cohesion and knowledge transmission. This daily task list requires approximately 20 to 25 person-hours of work, which distributed across 12 to 18 available adults means each adult averages 2 to 3 hours of primary work per day, sustainable indefinitely without creating exhaustion or burnout. The distribution flexibility matters tremendously here, because not every task needs doing every day at the same intensity, and the group size of 25 to 30 provides enough people that the group can surge effort when needed, putting 10 people on a major hunt when opportunity arises, or 8 people on gathering when a particular resource comes into abundance, or several people on hide processing when a successful large game hunt provides multiple hides that need treating before they spoil, while still maintaining adequate coverage of other essential tasks through the remaining adults, creating adaptability where the group responds to opportunities and challenges by dynamically reallocating effort without leaving critical tasks unattended or overworking anyone beyond sustainable levels. This flexibility requires having enough people that surge capacity exists, but not so many people that coordinating these surges becomes complicated, or that during normal periods too many adults lack meaningful work and become demoralized or create social problems through idleness. Smaller groups lack this surge capacity, where 15 people with 6 to 9 adults means every adult is effectively needed for baseline tasks continuously, making it difficult to respond to opportunities like a suddenly available large game animal or a briefly abundant plant resource without neglecting something else, forcing hard choices between competing priorities that larger groups handle easily through their deeper bench of capable workers. The smaller group also finds that absent or incapacitated adults create immediate crises, where if 2 adults are sick or injured simultaneously, representing perhaps 25 to 30% of the adult workforce, remaining adults must dramatically increase their work hours to cover the gap, often to unsustainable levels, creating a fragility where bad luck compounds into serious problems quickly. Whereas in a group of 25 to 30, 2 incapacitated adults represent only 10 to 15% of workforce reduction, absorbable through modest increases in others' effort without creating crisis conditions. Larger groups, conversely, begin encountering coordination problems and role confusion, where 40 to 50 people with 20 to 25 available adults means more workers than most tasks require, creating situations where multiple people show up for the same task, leading to inefficiency and social friction, or where people become specialized in narrow roles to avoid stepping on each other, losing the generalist flexibility that serves smaller groups well, edging toward formal work organization with assigned duties and supervisory roles that feel unnecessary and oppressive compared to the informal, dynamic work allocation that characterizes groups of 25 to 30, where everyone knows generally what needs doing and self-organizes around those needs without requiring formal coordination. The larger group also sees average workload drop potentially below the 3 to 5 hour range that provides just enough activity to feel purposeful without feeling burdensome, dipping toward 2 to 3 hours or even less during easy seasons, which sounds wonderful but actually creates social problems where people with insufficient work to feel useful begin experiencing the kind of meaning crisis that comes from not contributing meaningfully to the group, feeling redundant or unnecessary, creating tensions that groups with just right workload distribution don't experience. The archaeological evidence, indirect as always, nonetheless supports this picture through analysis of tool diversity and sophistication at different sites, where larger occupation sites show more standardized, specialized tools suggesting division of labor and craft specialization, while sites suggesting smaller groups show more generalist toolkits where individuals maintained broader ranges of simpler implements, and the medium-sized sites, those suggesting groups of 25 to 35 people, show the interesting pattern of reasonably sophisticated tools without excessive standardization, suggesting skilled work without rigid specialization, the generalist with strengths pattern that this group size naturally produces. These medium sites also show evidence of leisure activities, art creation, careful food processing, suggesting groups that had enough time after basic tasks to engage in activities beyond mere survival, confirming the relatively light workload that proper group sizing enables. So work distribution creates yet another convergence on 25 to 30 people, where 12 to 18 adults can distribute daily tasks such that everything necessary gets done without anyone being overworked, where surge capacity exists for opportunities or challenges without requiring crisis-level effort, where the social satisfaction of meaningful contribution remains high without crossing into burdensome toil, where generalist flexibility persists without forcing rigid specialization. Another balance where this particular group size outperforms both smaller and larger alternatives through finding the equilibrium between resources, tasks, and available workers. Rest knowing that tomorrow's work will be manageable, that enough hands exist to share the load, that the group is sized correctly for the work that survival requires. Neither too few people working too hard, nor too many people competing for purpose, just right for the rhythm of sustainable effort. Reproduction and genetic health require a breeding population large enough to avoid inbreeding depression, the accumulation of harmful recessive genes that occurs when close relatives reproduce repeatedly across generations, creating increased rates of genetic disorders, reduced fertility, lower infant survival, and general population decline that can eventually doom a group even if they manage all other survival challenges successfully, making genetic diversity a hard biological constraint on minimum group size that operates over longer timescales than most other factors, but ultimately proves just as fatal if violated. The mathematics of population genetics reveals that very small breeding populations, say under 20 individuals, face serious inbreeding problems within just a few generations, while breeding populations above about 20 to 25 individuals can maintain adequate genetic diversity for many generations if they occasionally exchange members with other groups, creating a minimum threshold that helps explain why groups rarely persisted below certain sizes, even when resources might have technically supported smaller numbers. For a group of 25 to 30 people, the breeding population, adults of reproductive age who are not closely related, typically consists of about 12 to 18 individuals, with roughly half being women, creating perhaps 6 to 9 women of childbearing age and 6 to 9 unrelated men at any given time. And this number, while not large by modern standards, proves adequate for maintaining genetic diversity across multiple generations, provided that groups occasionally encounter other groups and facilitate some genetic exchange through partnership and intergroup movement, creating what anthropologists call a metapopulation structure, where local groups maintain modest genetic diversity while the broader network of groups maintains much higher diversity through occasional mixing. The key threshold appears to be roughly 20 unrelated adults, below which inbreeding becomes increasingly difficult to avoid, even with cultural practices that prohibit or discourage close relative reproduction, because in a group of 15 with 6 to 9 adults, the pool of potential unrelated partners becomes extremely limited, especially given that some of those adults are already paired. Some may be considerably older or younger than any given individual, and some may be unsuitable for other social or personal reasons, creating scenarios where young adults approaching reproductive age have only one or two viable partners available. And if circumstances have already paired those individuals with others, the choice becomes reproducing with a related individual or not reproducing at all, neither option being good for long-term group survival. Archaeological genetic studies, looking at DNA from remains found at the same sites, do occasionally show evidence of close relative reproduction in small populations, suggesting that this was a real problem ancient groups faced and sometimes failed to avoid when their numbers dropped too low. Groups of 25 to 30, with 12 to 18 adults, provide much better partner availability, where young adults approaching reproductive maturity typically have 3 to 5 viable potential partners at any given time, enough to allow actual choice based on personal compatibility and social considerations, rather than being forced into partnerships by limited options, maintaining the social dynamic where relationships form through mutual attraction and social negotiation rather than through demographic necessity, preserving individual autonomy, and probably improving relationship stability and satisfaction, which matters for child outcomes since strained partnerships create worse child care environments than compatible ones. The larger pool also means that if particular partnerships prove infertile, which happens given the moderate fertility rates that characterize pre-agricultural populations, other options exist without requiring close relative reproduction as a backup strategy. The metapopulation structure amplifies these benefits considerably, because groups of 25 to 30 rarely existed in complete isolation, but rather maintained contact with several neighboring groups occupying adjacent territories, creating a broader network of perhaps 3 to 5 connected groups representing a total population of 75 to 150 people. And young adults in this network could and did form partnerships across group boundaries, moving between groups to join their partners or occasionally creating new groups through fission. When existing groups grew too large, providing genetic exchange that kept the smaller breeding pools from becoming problematic even across many generations. Evidence for this network structure comes from archaeological finds showing stylistic similarities in tool types and artistic motifs across multiple sites in the same regions, suggesting cultural continuity and contact, and from ethnographic accounts of modern hunter-gatherers who consistently maintain relationships with neighboring bands through visiting, gift exchange, shared ceremonies, and marriage partnerships, creating social networks much larger than any individual band. Smaller groups struggled more with genetic isolation, where groups of 15 or fewer often lacked enough internal genetic diversity and also lacked the social connections that provided access to partner options from other groups, either because their low numbers made them socially marginal and unappealing as alliance partners, or because their small territories placed them far from other groups geographically, creating situations where they reproduced within their limited pool for several generations, accumulating genetic problems that showed up as reduced infant survival, more birth defects, lower adult fertility, and eventually group extinction through demographic failure, a slow-motion catastrophe that wouldn't be obvious from any single generation's perspective, but that over 50 to 100 years resulted in the group disappearing from the landscape, with their territories eventually reoccupied by larger, healthier groups expanding from adjacent areas. Larger groups, interestingly, didn't gain proportional advantages from even more genetic diversity because the benefits plateau once you're above the critical threshold, where having 30 potential partners versus 10 provides substantial benefits, but having 50 versus 30 provides much smaller additional benefits, creating another case of diminishing returns beyond certain scales. And the larger group's tendency toward fissioning into smaller bands once they exceeded 35 to 40 people meant that they effectively operated as multiple smaller breeding populations anyway, gaining little genetic advantage from their total size, while potentially losing some of the social cohesion and coordination benefits that smaller unitary groups maintained. So reproduction and genetic diversity create a floor below which groups become unsustainable across multiple generations. And that floor sits around 20 to 25 people minimum, which provides adequate breeding population to avoid dangerous inbreeding, provided that occasional genetic exchange with other groups occurs, creating yet another factor that pushes toward groups of 25 to 30 as optimal, where numbers meet the genetic diversity requirement with comfortable margin, while not growing so large that the group becomes unwieldy for other reasons, another convergence where this size satisfies multiple constraints simultaneously, finding the intersection of what biology requires and what social and ecological factors make practical. Sleep now with the deep reassurance of healthy generations stretching forward, of genetic diversity maintained, of children born strong because the group is sized correctly, even for this invisible but crucial factor, the quiet confidence of a community that will persist through time. Decision-making in egalitarian groups requires that all adults participate, that everyone's voice matters, that consensus emerges through discussion rather than being imposed through hierarchy. And this participatory structure works beautifully in groups below certain sizes where actual conversation remains possible, where all voices can be heard in a single gathering, where nuances and concerns can be addressed directly without elaborate procedures. But this same structure becomes progressively more difficult as groups grow larger, creating pressure toward either formal organizational structures that many hunter-gatherers instinctively resist or group fissioning that maintains the small group dynamics everyone prefers. The transition point where direct democracy stops working smoothly seems to fall somewhere between 35 and 50 people, creating yet another factor that keeps most groups below that size threshold, and helps explain the strong clustering around 25 to 30 as the preferred group size. A group of 25 to 30 people can gather all adults, typically 12 to 18 individuals, in a single circle around a fire for evening discussions. And at this scale, actual conversation remains possible where each person can speak and be heard by all others, where back and forth discussion can happen naturally without someone controlling speaking order, where facial expressions and body language communicate as much as words, where the group can sense emerging consensus and know when everyone feels heard and ready to move forward with a decision. This direct democracy, requiring no votes or formal procedures or designated leaders, works precisely because the group is small enough that informal discussion equals effective decision-making, where social awareness of who agrees and who has reservations emerges naturally from the conversation without needing to be formally documented, creating a lightweight but effective governance system that maintains equality and personal autonomy while accomplishing necessary coordination. The types of decisions that groups face regularly include where to move next as seasons change or resources deplete, when to undertake major hunts requiring many participants, how to respond to threats from predators or other human groups, how to handle conflicts between members, what to do about individuals who consistently fail to contribute or who violate group norms, when to split into smaller foraging parties, and when to reunite, what knowledge to prioritize teaching to children, and more. A steady stream of choices that require group coordination, but that don't benefit from hierarchical decision-making because the relevant information is distributed across the group, known to different individuals through their different experiences and observations, making it important that everyone contributes to discussions so that decisions incorporate all available knowledge and everyone feels invested in outcomes. This participatory system works efficiently in groups of 25 to 30 because 12 to 18 adult participants represents few enough voices that everyone can speak without meetings becoming endless, where if each person speaks for just 2 or 3 minutes, total discussion time runs only 30 to 50 minutes, short enough that people remain focused and engaged, long enough that complex issues can be genuinely explored and consensus can emerge organically. The small size also means everyone knows everyone else well enough to interpret their communication styles, to know when someone's silence indicates agreement versus reservation, to recognize when someone is holding back concerns that need to be drawn out, creating nuanced communication that formal procedures in larger groups can rarely match. Compare this to smaller groups, where 10 to 12 people with 5 to 6 adults means decision-making remains easy and quick, perhaps too easy in the sense that fewer perspectives get considered, fewer alternatives get proposed, less knowledge gets brought to bear on problems, creating risk that decisions get made without adequate information or consideration simply because fewer minds are working on the problem. And while this efficiency sometimes helps, it also means more mistakes, more oversights, more unintended consequences that better deliberated decisions in larger groups might have avoided. The smaller group also lacks the checks and balances that naturally emerge in larger groups, where if one person has a bad idea but argues for it forcefully, 5 other people might not provide enough skeptical pushback, allowing poor decisions to proceed through social dynamics where no one wants to be the sole dissenter, whereas in a group of 25 to 30, that same bad idea faces more skeptics who collectively provide sufficient resistance that the idea gets properly challenged and either improved or discarded. On the larger end, groups of 40 to 50 people with 20 to 25 adults begin struggling with direct democracy because 25 people cannot all speak for 2 or 3 minutes without the discussion lasting over an hour, and maintaining focus and participation for hour-plus meetings becomes difficult, creating pressure to streamline discussion through various means that all represent departures from pure direct democracy. Limiting who can speak, having someone facilitate to control discussion flow, voting rather than seeking consensus, delegating decisions to smaller committees or respected individuals, all of which represent organizational complexity and implicit hierarchy that smaller groups avoid naturally. And while none of these mechanisms are terrible in themselves, they represent a qualitative change in group dynamics, a shift from everyone participates equally toward some people have more influence, even if that influence comes from facilitation roles or respect rather than formal authority. It still creates inequality that egalitarian societies instinctively resist. The larger group also begins facing the problem that not all adults know each other equally well. Where in a group of 50 with 25 adults, some pairs of adults might rarely interact directly because they're usually engaged in different activities or because they're at different life stages, creating social distance that makes consensus seeking more difficult because trust and understanding aren't uniform across the group, because some people's opinions carry more weight with some listeners than others, fragmenting the unified social field that makes direct democracy work smoothly in groups of 25 to 30 where everyone knows everyone intimately and equally. Archaeological evidence can't directly show us decision-making processes, but it can show us group sizes and living arrangements, and the consistent finding that Paleolithic occupation sites suggest groups of 25 to 35 people rather than larger villages supports the interpretation that humans consistently chose to maintain group sizes where direct democratic decision-making remained possible, that when groups grew beyond this size, they split into multiple bands, rather than developing the formal organizational structures that larger unified groups would require, suggesting a preference for maintaining egalitarian simplicity over achieving the potential advantages of larger-scale coordination, a preference that makes sense given that hierarchy's disadvantages, the loss of personal autonomy, and the inequalities of status and resource access significantly outweigh its coordination advantages for groups living mobile hunter-gatherer lifestyles where the relevant decision problems remain relatively simple and localized. So decision-making capacity provides another strong pressure toward groups of 25 to 30, where all adults can participate meaningfully in discussions, where consensus emerges naturally without formal procedures, where equality and autonomy are preserved through scale that makes hierarchy unnecessary, where the group remains small enough that governance requires no special structures or roles beyond the gathering around the evening fire, where all voices matter equally. Another factor converging on this same range, another way that 25 to 30 represents optimal balance. Rest now in the comfort of right-sized community where your voice matters, where decisions reflect collective wisdom without hierarchy, where being part of the group means being heard and valued equally, the satisfaction of participatory belonging that larger groups struggle to maintain. Conflict resolution shares similar dynamics with decision-making, but focuses specifically on interpersonal disputes rather than group-level choices. And here, too, the quality of resolution depends heavily on group size and the depth of relationships within the group, where conflicts in small groups with dense interconnections get resolved through direct personal engagement and community pressure, while conflicts in larger groups with thinner relationships increasingly require formal mediation or rules-based arbitration, changing the character of justice from personal and restorative toward impersonal and punitive. The transition point, once again, falls somewhere around 30 to 40 people, beyond which conflicts increasingly involve parties who don't know each other intimately and community members who lack strong relationships with both disputants, making personal resolution more difficult and formal systems more necessary. In a group of 25 to 30 where everyone knows everyone else intimately, conflicts between two individuals are never purely bilateral, but always involve the entire community, because both parties have relationships with all other members, creating a dense web of interconnections that naturally functions to both prevent conflicts from escalating and to resolve them when they occur. Prevention works because potential disputants know that behaving poorly will damage their relationships with everyone, not just with their immediate opponent, creating powerful incentives for restraint and compromise that reduce conflict frequency significantly compared to larger groups where individuals can afford to alienate some community members as long as they maintain support from others, effectively creating factions that don't exist in groups small enough that everyone needs everyone else's cooperation. When conflicts do occur despite prevention, the dense relationships enable resolution through several mechanisms that work precisely because the group is small enough for true intimacy to exist. First, other community members who have strong relationships with both disputants can mediate by appealing to each party's better nature, by reminding them of past positive interactions, by pointing out how the conflict harms the community they both depend on, creating emotional and social pressure toward reconciliation that works because the parties genuinely care about their relationships with the mediators and recognize that their standing in the community depends on being seen as reasonable and cooperative. Second, the community can apply collective pressure through subtle means like temporary social coolness or reduced cooperation, making disputants feel the cost of continued conflict without requiring formal punishment, creating incentives to resolve issues quickly and return to normal social relations. Third, and perhaps most importantly, conflicts in small groups rarely become purely win-lose, because both parties understand they'll continue living together indefinitely, creating strong motivation to find compromises that both can accept rather than insisting on total victory, maintaining working relationships even between parties who may never become friends, accepting imperfect solutions that allow continued coexistence rather than pursuing satisfaction that would make continued cohabitation impossible. This forward-looking orientation works precisely because the group is small enough that you cannot avoid someone you're in conflict with, cannot retreat to separate social circles or physical spaces that let you ignore each other, must instead find ways to interact adequately or face constant discomfort and reduced group cohesion that hurts everyone. In contrast, smaller groups of 15 or fewer sometimes struggle with conflict resolution through opposite mechanism, where if 2 of 6 adults are in serious conflict, the community is too small to provide adequate mediation, too disrupted by losing 1/3 of adult cooperation, too vulnerable to the conflict threatening group survival through the simple mathematics of not having enough people to afford serious division, creating pressure that sometimes forces premature or inadequate resolutions that leave underlying issues unaddressed, building resentment that explodes later, or alternatively leading to group fissioning where one party leaves, which in a group of 15 represents devastating population loss that the group may struggle to recover from demographically and socially. Larger groups face different problems where conflicts increasingly occur between individuals who don't know each other intimately or who operate in different social circles within the group, making personal resolution difficult because the dense web of mutual relationships doesn't exist to enable mediation, because the community cannot apply effective collective pressure when it's divided into factions that support different parties, because the scale makes it possible for disputants to avoid each other by associating with different subgroups rather than being forced to reconcile, allowing conflicts to fester and creating the need for more formal resolution mechanisms, designated mediators, or rules about acceptable behavior or authorities empowered to adjudicate disputes and enforce resolutions, all representing organizational complexity and hierarchy that groups of 25 to 30 avoid through the natural conflict resolution that intimate relationships enable. Archaeological evidence obviously cannot directly show conflict resolution processes, but can show evidence of interpersonal violence rates through skeletal trauma analysis, and interestingly, sites suggesting mid-sized groups show relatively low rates of violence-related injuries compared to both smaller and larger group sites, supporting the interpretation that groups of 25 to 30 maintained social cohesion and conflict resolution effectiveness, that both smaller groups, with their vulnerability to devastating conflicts, and larger groups, with their factional dynamics and reduced cohesion, struggled to match. The skeletal evidence shows that violence did occur, humans being humans, but occurred less frequently in mid-sized groups, suggesting that the social dynamics at this scale genuinely reduced conflict through the prevention and resolution mechanisms that dense but adequately numerous relationships enable. So conflict resolution provides another factor pushing toward groups of 25 to 30, where intimate relationships create both conflict prevention through community pressure and effective resolution through personal mediation, where the group is large enough to provide mediators and community pressure, but small enough that relationships remain truly intimate, and no one can avoid consequences of their actions, where justice remains personal and restorative, rather than formal and punitive, maintaining social cohesion and equality through scale that makes complex systems unnecessary. Feel that balance now. The security of living among people who know you well enough to hold you accountable, but who also care enough to seek reconciliation over punishment. The comfort of right-sized community where conflicts resolve personally rather than through impersonal rules, where your relationships matter enough to motivate good behavior, and where community support helps repair things when behavior falls short. Territory defense requires adequate numbers to monitor boundaries, patrol ranges, respond to incursions, and actively deter potential intruders, whether animal or human, creating a minimum threshold below which groups become vulnerable to predation and displacement. But defense also becomes more difficult as territory expands beyond what the available defenders can effectively cover, creating an optimization problem where the ratio of territory size to defender numbers determines security. And this ratio, when calculated against the resource needs that determine how much territory a group requires, produces yet another convergence on groups of 25 to 30 as optimal, where defensive capability matches territorial requirements in a sustainable balance. For a group of 25 to 30 people requiring roughly 12 to 15 square miles of territory, the defensive problem involves monitoring and patrolling approximately 15 to 20 linear miles of territory boundary, responding to predator presence or human incursions anywhere within that range, maintaining enough group visibility that potential intruders understand the territory is occupied and defended, and occasionally concentrating force at specific points to actively drive away persistent threats. 12 to 18 adults, of whom perhaps 10 to 15 are capable of effective defense, can accomplish this defensive mission through a combination of strategies that work precisely because the scale allows both coverage and concentration. Enough people to patrol regularly while also maintaining a capable force at the main camp. Enough strength that concentrating 6 to 8 defenders at a point of incursion creates overwhelming local superiority against typical threats. The daily patrol patterns that provide adequate territory defense involve 2 to 4 adults walking different sections of the territory boundary and interior, checking for signs of predator presence or other human groups, maintaining trails and sight lines, occasionally marking boundaries through various means, creating comprehensive coverage of the territory over weekly or bi-weekly cycles, while any given day only requires a few hours of patrol effort from a few individuals, sustainable indefinitely without exhausting defenders. The remaining adults stay with the main camp, providing security there, especially important when children are present. And these camp defenders can respond rapidly if patrols encounter threats they cannot handle alone, concentrating force quickly, because the territory size means patrols are never more than a few hours' travel from camp, creating a mobile defense system that works because scale allows both dispersion and concentration as situations demand. This defense system breaks down in predictable ways when groups are too small or too large relative to their territories. A group of 15 people with 10 square miles of territory faces a boundary of roughly 12 to 15 miles, but has only 6 to 9 adults for defense, and the numbers simply don't work as well, where maintaining adequate patrol coverage requires higher percentage of the adult workforce, leaving fewer people at camp, reducing surge capacity for responding to threats, creating gaps in coverage that predators and rival groups can learn to exploit, making the territory less secure despite being smaller. The smaller group also lacks the numbers to reliably deter human incursions, where 6 defenders are easier to challenge or overwhelm than 12 defenders, making the territory more attractive to displaced groups seeking new ranges, creating persistent pressure that the smaller group struggles to resist without either accepting violations of their territory or fighting more frequently, neither option being sustainable. Conversely, a group of 40 to 50 people requiring 25 square miles faces a boundary approaching 30 miles, and despite having perhaps 20 to 25 capable defenders, the ratio has shifted unfavorably, where 30 miles of boundary requires more patrol effort than 25 people can provide while maintaining other necessary activities, creating either gaps in coverage or overwork of defenders. And the larger territory size means that concentrating force takes longer, that responding to an incursion in the far corner of the territory might require 6 hours of rapid travel, allowing situations to deteriorate before help arrives, reducing the effective deterrent that rapid concentration provides. The larger group also creates a more visible and obvious target, where their greater numbers mean more noise, more smoke from fires, more territorial disturbance, making their presence more noticeable to potential threats and rivals, attracting more attention even as the larger territory's defense becomes more difficult. Archaeological evidence supports these dynamics through patterns of site locations and densities, where mid-sized occupation sites cluster in defensible locations near resources with good visibility and access to water, suggesting groups that could effectively defend favorable spots and hold them over time, while evidence of smaller groups shows more dispersed, temporary occupation of less optimal locations, and evidence of larger concentrations shows either brief, seasonal gatherings that didn't represent permanent groups or complex fortification efforts that required substantial communal labor, neither pattern suggesting sustainable permanent occupation by hunter-gatherers living mobile lifestyles. The pattern suggests that groups of 25 to 30 consistently obtained and held the best territories because their numbers matched defensive requirements for territories of that size, while both smaller groups and larger groups struggled with defense-to-territory mismatches that made them less competitive in landscape occupation. The defense-to-territory calculation also interacts with resource quality, where territories vary in productivity, such that some 12 square mile areas support 25 people comfortably, while other 12 square mile areas barely support 15 people, and groups occupying richer territories face more pressure from rivals seeking to displace them and claim those resources, requiring stronger defense that only adequate numbers can provide, creating scenarios where the richest territories get occupied by groups of optimal size who can both utilize the resources and defend them effectively, while marginal territories end up occupied by smaller groups unable to compete for better locations or left unoccupied as buffer zones between defended territories. This dynamic would have created visible clustering of optimal-sized groups in favorable locations and scarcity of very small or very large groups anywhere, matching the archaeological record's patterns. So territorial defense creates another pressure toward groups of 25 to 30, where defensive capability matches. Territorial size required by the group's resource needs, where enough defenders exist to patrol boundaries and concentrate force as needed, while not growing so numerous that their resource needs expand territory beyond what they can effectively defend. Another factor converging on this same range, another way that 25 to 30 represents the balance point where competing demands align, rests secure in the knowledge of adequate defense, of territory properly sized and effectively guarded, of enough strength to deter threats without creating the vulnerabilities that come from overexpansion, the quiet confidence of a group scaled correctly for the land it occupies and the defense that occupation requires. Mobility represents another crucial capability that hunter-gatherer groups depend on for responding to resource fluctuations, environmental changes, threats, and opportunities where the ability to move efficiently when needed, whether relocating camps seasonally or responding to immediate dangers, can mean the difference between thriving and starving, between escaping threats and facing disaster, making group size a determinant of mobility that creates pressure against growing too large, even when resources might temporarily support larger numbers, because the loss of mobility represents a vulnerability that can prove fatal when circumstances change, as they inevitably do. A group of 25 to 30 people, with typical possessions and equipment for a mobile hunter-gatherer lifestyle, can pack up a camp and move in a few hours, traveling 10 to 15 miles in a day if needed without extraordinary effort, maintaining this mobility year-round, except perhaps during brief periods when elderly or ill members need extended rest, or when weather makes travel genuinely dangerous, creating a group that remains fluid and responsive to its environment, capable of following seasonal resources, avoiding threats, exploiting opportunities that require repositioning, maintaining the flexibility that mobile hunting-gathering lifestyle requires for optimal success. The group size allows for both sufficient strength that travel remains safe from predators and small enough size that logistics remain manageable through informal coordination, where everyone knows the plan and their role without requiring complex organization. The mobility calculation involves several factors that all scale with group size but at different rates, creating optimal ranges where mobility remains adequate without sacrificing other benefits. First, the total amount of gear and possessions that must be transported scales linearly with population, where 30 people have roughly twice the stuff of 15 people, requiring twice the carrying capacity. But carrying capacity also scales with population, since more people means more carriers, creating a wash that would seem to make mobility group size neutral, except that very large groups accumulate more communal possessions, more shared equipment, more stored resources that don't scale linearly with population, but rather scale with organizational complexity. And very small groups carry less per capita because they need less specialization and redundancy. Second, the coordination required to move scales more than linearly with group size, where 15 people can essentially just start walking and everyone keeps up naturally, while 40 people need more explicit coordination about pacing, rest stops, who's helping whom, what order to travel in, requiring communication and decision-making that slows the process and creates more opportunities for confusion or errors, reducing the group's ability to move quickly when speed matters. A group of 25 to 30 falls in the middle, requiring some coordination, but not so much that it becomes cumbersome, allowing efficient movement that doesn't require elaborate planning or formal organization. Third, the vulnerability during travel scales with group size in complex ways, where very small groups face high risk from predators during travel when scattered over distance, while large groups are safer from predators, but create more visible trails and disturbances that make them easier to track and more attractive targets for rival groups. And mid-sized groups find a balance where they're large enough to deter most predatory threats while remaining small enough to move discreetly when needed, maintaining options that extreme sizes lack. The seasonal mobility patterns that characterize most hunter-gatherer societies involve moving camp perhaps 4 to 8 times per year, following resource availability and climate patterns, relocating from summer ranges to winter ranges and back, moving to specific locations for seasonal abundances like salmon runs or nut harvests or animal migrations, covering circuits that might span 50 to 100 miles total annual movement, and these patterns work smoothly for groups of 25 to 30 who can pack and move efficiently enough that relocation doesn't consume excessive time or energy, maintaining mobility as a valuable capability rather than a disruptive burden that that they avoid whenever possible. Groups smaller than 20 struggle with mobility for different reasons than they struggle with defense or resource use, where the mobility itself might be easier to execute but becomes more dangerous due to inadequate numbers for safe travel through predator-rich landscapes, forcing smaller groups to move less frequently and maintain more fortified home bases, reducing their ability to follow resources and making them more vulnerable to localized resource failures or threats they cannot flee from effectively. The smaller group's reduced mobility shows up as less diverse artifact assemblages, suggesting more restricted ranges, and skeletal evidence suggesting more nutritional stress from inability to seasonally relocate to optimal areas. Larger groups face the opposite problem, where mobility becomes increasingly difficult to execute efficiently, where groups of 40 to 50 require substantially more coordination, move more slowly, leave more obvious trails, and increasingly shift toward semi-sedentary patterns where they maintain more permanent base camps and send out smaller foraging parties rather than moving the whole group, beginning the transition toward the settled villages that eventually enable agriculture but that mobile hunter-gatherers typically avoid because settlement creates vulnerabilities through resource depletion around permanent sites and defensive challenges from maintaining year-round presence in single locations. The archaeological evidence shows that larger groups tend toward longer occupation of single sites and more investment in those sites through substantial construction, suggesting reduced mobility that comes from logistical constraints of moving large groups. So mobility represents another factor favoring groups of 25 to 30, where the group remains small enough to move efficiently when needed, while large enough to move safely through landscapes containing predators and potentially hostile rival groups, maintaining the flexibility and responsiveness that mobile hunting-gathering requires for optimal success, without sacrificing the security and resource utilization benefits that adequate numbers provide. Another balance point where this particular size outperforms alternatives. Sleep. Knowing that the group can move when needed, that flexibility remains available, that tomorrow, if necessary, the group could relocate to better hunting grounds or away from approaching threats. The security that comes from mobility preserved through proper scaling that keeps the group neither too large to move nor too small to move safely. Winter survival creates the harshest test of group size adequacy, where cold conditions and reduced daylight and scarcer resources all combine to create a seasonal bottleneck that culls groups lacking adequate numbers, while groups of optimal size weather these conditions with acceptable losses, creating strong evolutionary pressure toward sizes that provide sufficient winter survival capacity, even if that means being slightly larger than optimal for summer conditions when resources abundant and work lighter. The winter challenge involves maintaining fire continuously through long, cold nights, finding and hunting game in difficult conditions when most large animals migrate and smaller animals become scarce or hibernate, caring for sick and injured members who accumulate over the year and become critical liabilities when conditions deteriorate, sharing warmth through communal sleeping, and simply maintaining morale and cohesion through long periods of relative inactivity and discomfort, all tasks that scale with group size in ways that create minimum thresholds below which winter mortality rises dramatically. Fire maintenance during winter represents one clear threshold, where keeping fires burning continuously through 15-hour nights requires either massive fuel expenditure or frequent tending, and groups too small to maintain watch rotations that keep someone awake and alert throughout night struggle with fires dying out, creating immediate danger from cold exposure and longer-term problems from inability to cook food or warm bodies, while groups of adequate size can rotate fire-tending responsibilities such that no one loses too much sleep while fire remains continuously maintained, creating security that smaller groups achieve only through exhausting effort that accumulates into dangerous fatigue over weeks of winter conditions. A group of 25 to 30 with 12 to 18 adults can maintain three-person watch rotations through night, each person staying alert for 4 to 5 hours before being relieved, getting adequate sleep themselves while ensuring fire never dies. A sustainable pattern that groups of 15 with 6 to 9 adults struggle to maintain, since two-person rotations with 5 to 6 hour shifts cross into dangerous fatigue territory. Hunting in winter conditions requires more effort for less return as game becomes scarce and tracking becomes difficult through snow or frozen ground, demanding more hunters spending more time and energy to find and take enough game to feed the group. Creating workload increases precisely when cold conditions already require more calories for body temperature maintenance, squeezing groups from both sides where food needs increase while food acquisition becomes harder. Groups of 25 to 30 can field larger hunting parties, 6 to 8 hunters, that can pursue and take what large game remains available through coordinated efforts, while smaller groups of 15 struggle to field enough hunters to take large game effectively, forcing reliance on smaller animals that provide less return per hunting effort, creating a downward spiral where hunting effort increases while returns decrease, slowly starving the group even as they work harder than ever. Care for sick and injured accumulates over the year, such that by winter most groups contain several members with reduced functionality, whether from injury still healing, chronic illness, advanced age, or temporary sickness from winter ailments, creating a care burden that groups must shoulder while also handling all normal survival tasks in harder conditions. Groups of 25 to 30 can absorb 3 to 5 incapacitated members, roughly 15 to 25% of adult population, distributing their care and their lost productivity across remaining healthy adults through modest workload increases, sustainable temporarily during the winter months until spring arrives and health improves, while smaller groups of 15 losing even 2 adults to incapacity, representing 25 to 33% of workforce, face crisis conditions where remaining adults become severely overworked, trying to both care for the incapacitated and handle all essential tasks, creating exhaustion that makes more people sick, compounds the crisis, and can result in group failure through a cascading collapse where overwork creates more illness, creates more overwork, until no one remains healthy enough to maintain the group. Archaeological evidence strongly supports winter bottleneck effects through skeletal evidence, showing that most deaths occurred during winter months based on bone growth patterns and other markers, that groups occupying sites in harsher climates showed evidence of larger group sizes compared to groups in milder climates who managed with smaller numbers, and that site abandonment and group failure evidenced through abrupt cessation of occupation and scattered remains suggesting death or dispersal rather than organized relocation occurred disproportionately during winter periods, confirming that winter represented the critical test that separated adequate-sized groups from inadequate ones. The winter survival threshold appears to fall somewhere around 20 to 25 people minimum, below which winter mortality rises sharply, and group failure becomes increasingly probable over multiple winter cycles, while groups above this threshold experience winter losses but rarely face existential crises from winter conditions alone, surviving to reproduce and rebuild during productive summer months, creating populations of groups clustering above this minimum and combined with other factors that create pressure against growing beyond about 35 people, producing the consistent 25 to 30 range that archaeological and ethnographic evidence reveals. Winter survival represents perhaps the most immediately life or death of all the factors we've considered, the one that most directly culled groups lacking adequate size through simple, brutal mortality rather than through subtle competitive disadvantages that only matter over longer timescales. So winter survival creates a floor under group size, a minimum below which groups struggle to persist through multiple winter cycles and above which winter remains challenging but manageable. And that floor aligns closely with the 25 to 30 range that other factors independently push toward, creating yet another convergence on this same number from yet another direction. Another way that 25 to 30 represents not arbitrary culture but biological and ecological optimization, the result of multiple selection pressures all pointing toward the same answer. Rest, now knowing that the group contains enough hands to weather winter's challenges, enough strength to maintain fire and find food and care for sick through the hardest months, enough resilience to survive winter's test and emerge into spring ready to thrive again, the deep security of right-sized community that passes winter's judgment year after year. All these factors, resource requirements and territory size, hunting capability, gathering efficiency, social brain limits, child rearing capacity, knowledge preservation, work distribution, genetic diversity, decision-making scale, conflict resolution dynamics, territorial defense, mobility maintenance, and winter survival, all these separate optimization problems with their own logic and thresholds remarkably converge on roughly the same answer, producing consistent pressure toward groups of 25 to 30 people, give or take a few depending on specific environmental conditions and resource availability, creating what scientists call a robust optimum, where multiple different factors all point to the same solution, suggesting that this solution is deeply embedded in human ecology and unlikely to shift much even across widely varying circumstances. This convergence explains why hunter-gatherer groups across different continents and climates and time periods consistently cluster in this size range, not because of cultural tradition copied from group to group, but because these numbers represent a mathematical sweet spot where human groups balance all the competing demands that survival places upon them. The number isn't exactly 25 or exactly 30, but rather a range roughly spanning 25 to 35, where all the factors we've discussed remain well balanced, with perhaps some shifting toward the lower end in rich environments where resources are easy and toward the upper end in harsh environments where larger buffers against misfortune prove valuable, creating a band rather than a single number, but a band narrow enough that we can meaningfully talk about optimal hunter-gatherer group size as falling in this range rather than varying widely from 15 to 50 or 10 to 100, actually clustering around a specific scale that reflects genuine optimization. What happens when groups fall outside this range reveals the optimization through the problems that emerge. Groups below about 20 people can survive but face elevated risks across multiple dimensions. They struggle to field adequate hunting parties, lack sufficient gatherers to cover their territories, have inadequate winter survival margins, face genetic diversity problems over generations, cannot effectively defend their territories from rivals, lose critical knowledge when skilled individuals die, overwork their adults, and lack the social complexity that makes human groups satisfying and stimulating. These groups exist, appearing in the archaeological record and in ethnographic accounts, but they appear temporarily as transient states between larger groups splitting and smaller groups merging, or as dying groups contracting through attrition, rarely as stable equilibria that persist across generations, confirming that below 20 represents inadequate size for long-term sustainability. Groups above about 35 to 40 people can survive and do appear in the record, especially during seasons of resource abundance or in particularly rich environments. But they face different problems. Their resource needs expand their territories beyond effective defensive scale. Their decision-making becomes cumbersome, requiring formal organization. Their knowledge redundancy becomes excessive while their coordination becomes difficult. Their mobility decreases as logistics complexity increases, and most importantly, they strongly tend toward fissioning into smaller bands, splitting into two groups of 15 to 20 each, rather than remaining unified as groups of 35 to 40, suggesting that the problems of larger scale outweigh benefits enough that people actively choose to split and reform at smaller scale when given the choice, revealing preference for the 25 to 30 range that other factors also point toward. This fissioning dynamic proves particularly important for understanding the stability of the 25 to 30 range, because groups grow naturally through births when conditions are favorable, where a group of 27 could grow to 35 over a decade of good survival and successful reproduction. And yet we don't see continued growth toward 50 or 75 or larger. Instead, seeing groups choosing to split once they reach 35 to 40, creating two new groups that each contain that optimal 25 to 30 range again, suggesting that humans instinctively recognize when groups have grown beyond comfortable size and deliberately reorganize to return to optimal scale, maintaining this population architecture through active choice rather than just through external constraints. Another form of evidence that 25 to 30 represents genuine optimization rather than arbitrary cultural convention. The opposite dynamic also operates where groups suffering losses through disease, accidents, predation, or conflicts that reduce them below about 20 people often seek to merge with neighboring groups or recruit members from other groups, rebuilding toward that 25 to 30 range rather than accepting continued existence at inadequate size, showing awareness that being too small creates problems, and that optimal size provides benefits worth pursuing through social reorganization. These dynamics of fissioning when too large and merging when too small create a homeostatic mechanism that keeps most groups within the optimal range most of the time, creating the observed clustering around 25 to 30 that archaeological and ethnographic evidence consistently reveals. So the final answer to why cavemen lived in groups of exactly 25 to 30 people comes from recognizing this convergence of multiple optimization problems, all producing the same answer, where resource and territory requirements, hunting and gathering efficiency, social cognitive limits, child rearing needs, knowledge preservation requirements, work distribution, sustainability, genetic diversity minimums, decision-making capacity, conflict resolution dynamics, territorial defense capabilities, mobility maintenance, and winter survival thresholds all independently push toward groups of this particular size, creating a robust optimum that persists across varying conditions, and that humans maintain through active choices about when to split larger groups and when to merge smaller groups, revealing that this number represents not arbitrary tradition, but fundamental human ecology, the natural scale at which small-scale societies balance all the competing demands that survival places on them, finding the sweet spot where size provides benefits without creating problems, where numbers offer strength without unwieldiness, where community provides security without losing intimacy, the Goldilocks zone of human group size that served our species successfully for tens of thousands of years and continues to influence how we organize and interact even in modern contexts, far removed from hunter-gatherer lifestyles. Rest now in this understanding that the number 25 to 30 represents deep wisdom embedded in human experience. The solution to a complex multivariable optimization problem worked out not through mathematics, but through the patient, unforgiving teacher of survival itself. Generation after generation, discovering that groups of this size work better than groups either larger or smaller. Maintaining this knowledge not through explicit teaching, but through the lived experience of being part of appropriately scaled community, where security and autonomy balance, where work and rest balance, where intimacy and diversity balance, where all the factors that make human life viable and satisfying come together in the particular configuration that groups of 25 to 30 people naturally create, the perfect number found through deep time and encoded in our social instincts, the size at which humans thrive.